I'm going to be reading to you excerpts from Globalization, Ethical Institutional Concerns from Acta 7. This was published by the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences and has been published on the Vatican's official website. I'll be having links in the sidebar. If you want to check these out for yourselves, you can look up the other actas by typing in the address for the Vatican's website, which is www.Vatican.va, and then type in Acta, and then Acta 1 or 2, whichever one you want to read. I'm still trying to figure out exactly why these have been published, why they've been published online, as they are discussing the New World Order and this globalization that's happening. And on another page of theirs I'll be reading an excerpt to you from, they actually do mention the New World Order. As I thought this was extremely important, being that this is official Vatican information, I decided to share this with you.
It has to be noted that this passage is primarily concerned with economic globalization, but is evident from the whole context that globalization in Catholic social teaching has a more general meaning. This can be summarized in the following way. Firstly, the Catholic social teaching sees globalization as an instrument by which to further the well-being of mankind, an ethical principle which has always been defended by that teaching. Secondly, the free national market does not automatically guarantee the common good, and it thus requires laws and rules. This requirement does not only apply to national markets. Globalized markets equally require a legal framework and legal direction. Thirdly, in a global market, this cannot be done on a purely national level, but requires international agreements and institutions. Catholic school teaching is aware that this is a very difficult task. It says explicitly that this can be achieved only if the major economic powers and leading countries agree. However, these countries are not only under political pressure, they are also under economic pressure, for instance, the pressure of the financial markets. Fourthly, this control of the global market should be safeguarded not only by national and international authorities, but also by social forces. This corresponds to the principle of subsidiarity, which affirms that the intermediate forces between the individual and the state have the primary role in ordering the free market towards the common good. Fifthly, in all efforts, special attention should be paid to developing countries. This means that the advantages of globalization should not be restricted to the privileged countries, for instance, the United States of America, the nations of Western Europe and Japan, but extended to, in a particular way, to countries and continents which have not yet entered or are not yet ready for entry into the competition of the global market. Sixthly, Catholic social teaching is convinced that globalization requires a substantial number of economic and political measures, but it is at the same time of the view that these political and economic measures have to be based upon ethical principles and motivations. The main question which presents itself here is the sources and providers of these ethical values. It is important for Catholic social teaching in this context to invoke a new ecumenical spirit. This is because it is convinced that the challenges of the new globalization can only be met by an ecumenical effort on the part of the Christian churches, the great religions of the world, and all men of good will. Conclusion. Globalization is a challenge not only to the economic, social, and political forces of society and the world. It is also a challenge for the social teaching of the Church. This teaching has progressed from a rather limited point of view to a growing awareness of the new challenges of globalization. But as the Encyclical Consensus Annus observes, much remains to be done, for instance, as regards to the influence of the financial markets, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, the open question of intergenerational solidarity, and the protection of nature and the environment. Page 52. The long-term goal of good national and global development must be to secure an adequate level of morally basic capabilities for everyone in the world, regardless of nationality, ethnicality, age, gender, or sexual preference. With a multifaceted notion of globalization, some kinds of globalization, for instance, such as global phenomena and a world network of illegal drugs distribution, sex tourism, which by the way means traveling to visit someone for the purposes of sex, although it could be for romance or whatever, but this is what would be determined as a visit for this purpose of sex, which is called sex tourism, forced migrations, and HIV/AIDS are bad and should be resisted. Other kinds of globalization, such as the global dispersion of human rights and democratic norms, are good and should be promoted. Most kinds of globalization, such as open trade, foreign direct investments, and multinationals, are a mixed blessing. The extent to which these sorts of globalization enhance, secure, or restore human capabilities will depend on context and especially on how a national policy integrates and shapes global forces. How did information technologies drive to globalization? In at least two ways. First, information and communication technologies bridge distances and allow for real-time processes to take place between distant actors. On these premises, two different types of feedback loops can emerge. On one side, structured and permanent feedback loops that are integrated into specific institutions or mechanisms. Such carefully designed and engineered loops serve as management tools in complex organizations. On the other side, technology also allows for more or less focused dissemination of information outside any structured feedback loops. Such dissemination of information may bring about the emergence of spontaneous or unstructured feedback loops. This happens when people change their behavior as a consequence to receiving an information. This is from Populorum, Progressio, Encyclical of Pope Paul VI of the Development of Peoples, March 26, 1967. And this is part 83, To All Men of Goodwill. Finally, we look to all men of goodwill, reminding them that civil progress and economic development are the only real road to peace. Delegates to international organizations, public officials, gentlemen of the press, teachers and educators, all of you must realize that you have your part to play in the construction of a new world order. We ask God to enlighten and strengthen you all so that you may persuade all men to turn their attention to these grave questions and prompt nations to work together toward their solution. Educators, you should resolve to inspire young people with a love for the needy nations. Gentlemen of the press, your job is to place before your eyes the initiatives that are being taken to promote mutual aid and the tragic spectacle of misery and poverty that people tend to ignore in order to solve their consciences.
It should also be mentioned that according to these individuals speaking on behalf of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, that this globalization is a phenomenon, a natural occurrence, and not something that is controlled or orchestrated. Now, that doesn't mean that that is so, but that is what they are saying. And of course, they are taking a high moral ground on their position on what is occurring. But it is interesting that they are acknowledging that it exists and that they are participating in the development of globalization and towards a new world order.